gospel does not ask us to approve everything that everyone does, but it does ask us to refuse to place limits on God's mercy. Pope Francis has repeatedly reminded the Church that the Church is not a club of the perfect, but a place where wounded people encounter the healing mercy of Christ.
मूलं समीक्ष्य यत्र गम्यता सर्वेषां मार्गं तथैव प्रवृत्ति.
Sisters and brothers, hearty welcome to you to the 20th Sunday in Ordinary Time. There are some gospel passages that comfort us immediately, and there are others that first disturb us and only afterwards transform us. Today's gospel belongs to the second category. The encounter between Jesus and the Canaanite woman is striking because Jesus appears silent, the disciples appear impatient, and the woman seems to face one obstacle after another. Yet she refuses to give up. Finally, Jesus says to her, "Woman, great is your faith." The three readings today reveal one magnificent truth. God's mercy is greater than our boundaries, and genuine faith refuses to give up even when God seems silent. Isaiah announces God's plan that His house will become a house of prayer for all peoples. St. Paul tells us that the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. And the gospel gives us a living example of that universal mercy in a Canaanite woman who, though considered an outsider, becomes an extraordinary model of faith. There is a story of a young musician who once performed before a great master. After his performance, the master remained silent. The young man interpreted the silence as failure and went home discouraged. But instead of giving up, he practiced harder and returned months later. After listening to him again, the master said, "Now you are beginning to understand the music." The young man asked, "What changed?" The master replied, "The music did not change. You changed. The silence that discouraged you became the discipline that formed you." Something similar happens to the Canaanite woman. The silence of Jesus does not destroy her faith. It deepens it. The obstacle does not become the end of her prayer. It becomes the place where her faith grows. Matthew the evangelist deliberately identifies the woman as a Canaanite, a detail that carries considerable theological significance. The community for which Matthew wrote consisted predominantly of Jewish Christians, and questions surrounding the inclusion of Gentiles in the Christian community were still a matter of debate. During his earthly ministry, Jesus had instructed the disciples to proclaim the gospel first to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and had directed them not to go among the Gentiles. This instruction, understood within the emerging life of the early church, could give rise to questions and misunderstandings regarding the place of Gentiles within the Christian community. Consequently, differences of opinion arose concerning their acceptance into the church and their full participation in the salvation offered through Christ. Against this background, Matthew presents the encounter between Jesus and the Canaanite woman as a decisive theological statement. Faith, rather than ethnic or religious origin, becomes the decisive criterion for belonging to the people of God. Her persistent faith in Jesus and his compassionate response to her reveal that God's saving mercy cannot be confined within the boundaries of Israel. Through this encounter, the evangelist brings to light the church's ultimate conviction that the gospel of Christ is destined for all peoples, and that every person who approaches Jesus with genuine faith is embraced by his saving love. The Canaanites were historically associated with Israel's enemies. She represents someone outside the covenant community. Yet she approaches Jesus and cries, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." Strangely, it is a pagan woman who addresses Jesus as Lord and Son of David. She possesses a recognition of Jesus that many insiders lack. The disciples, however, responded differently. "Send her away, for she is shouting after us." The woman sees a possibility where the disciples see a disturbance. This is one of the great spiritual dangers of religion. We can become so concerned about protecting our boundaries that we forget the wideness of God's mercy. Isaiah had already proclaimed God's intention centuries earlier. "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." The prophet is announcing a radical movement from exclusion to inclusion. God's people are not chosen so that others may be rejected. They are chosen so that God's salvation may reach others through them. Israel's election was never meant to become a spiritual monopoly. God's covenant with Israel was meant to become a channel through which blessing would reach the nations. St. Paul develops precisely this mystery in the letter to the Romans. The inclusion of the Gentiles does not mean that God has abandoned Israel. Rather, God's plan is mysteriously working through both Israel and the Gentiles. Paul concludes, "For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable." This is one of the most beautiful affirmations in the New Testament. God does not casually cancel his promises. God does not discard people when they fail. God does not withdraw his mercy because human beings have become complicated. The human being may abandon God, but God does not abandon his promise. Therefore, the question for us to ponder is, who are the Canaanites in our lives? Perhaps they are people of another religion. Perhaps they are people whose political opinions irritate us. Perhaps they are people who have made serious mistakes. Perhaps they are members of our own family whom we have emotionally excluded. Perhaps they are the poor, migrants, prisoners, addicts, divorced persons, those who struggle socially, or those whose lifestyle we find difficult to understand. The gospel does not ask us to approve everything that everyone does, but it does ask us to refuse to place limits on God's mercy. Pope Francis has repeatedly reminded the Church that the Church is not a club of the perfect, but a place where wounded people encounter the healing mercy of Christ. The Church exists not merely for those who are already inside, but also for those who are still searching for a way home. The most disturbing line in the Gospel is, "But he did not answer her a word." The woman cries, but Jesus is silent. The disciples become irritated. But she continues. How many people know this experience? I prayed, but nothing happened. I asked God, but God seemed silent. I prayed for healing, but the illness remained. The Bible itself is full of people who experienced God's apparent silence. Job cried out. The psalmist asked, How long, O Lord? And even Jesus on the cross cried, my God, why have you forsaken me? Therefore, we must remember, God's silence is not necessarily God's absence. Mother Teresa experienced profound spiritual darkness, yet she continued serving the poorest of the poor. Her life teaches us an important lesson. Faith is not always feeling that God is near. Faith is trusting God even when we do not feel His presence. The Canaanite woman's prayer becomes increasingly simple. First, have mercy on me. Then, Lord, help me. There is deep spirituality in those words. Sometimes the most mature prayer is not a long prayer, but a simple one. Lord, help me. When we cannot understand, say it. When we are afraid, say it. When the future is uncertain, say it. Yes, even when God seems silent, say it. Lord, help me. Great faith is faith tested by difficulties. The woman encounters another obstacle when Jesus says, it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Her response is astonishing. Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. She does not walk away offended, nor does she argue, nor surrender. She remains before Jesus. She believes that even a crumb from Christ is enough. And then Jesus says, Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish. What made her faith great? Her faith is great because it is persistent, humble, and completely centered on Jesus. She had no claim except mercy, no argument except trust, no strength except perseverance. This is why, my sisters and brothers, the Canaanite woman is such a powerful model for us. Faith does not mean that we never struggle. Faith means that we do not stop turning towards Christ in the midst of the struggle. The disciples wanted to send the woman away. Jesus ultimately praises her faith. There is a lesson here for the church. The church is Catholic because the heart of Christ is wide enough for every nation, culture, and people. The Canaanite woman reminds us that the person whom we consider an outsider may become the person through whom God teaches us something about faith. The Canaanite woman enters the gospel as an outsider, but leaves it as one of the greatest teachers of faith. For the mercy of God is always greater than the boundaries we create. And one day, perhaps after the longest struggle, we too may hear the words, Great is your faith. May our faith become like that of the Canaanite woman, humble enough to ask, courageous enough to persist, compassionate enough to intercede, and strong enough never to let go of Christ. Amen.
समीक्ष्य यत्र गम्यता सर्वेषां मार्गः तथैव प्रवृत्तिः